Ethmoid bone is the weirdest shaped bone in the cranium. I'm going to show you from both sides. This is the ethmoid bone right here. And when I get the lights on, I'll show you the exploded skull because you'll see the entire shape of the ethmoid. It has this ridge right in the center. And this ridge, it looks like a rooster's comb, or what we call a cock's comb. And the Latin for cock's comb is crista galli. So this is the crista galli, or cock's comb. There's a whole bunch of little openings on both sides of the crista galli. And they make up what we call the cribriform plate of the ethmoid bone. And that's where the nerves from your nose travel up to your olfactory nerve. And if you look at a brain, you can see the olfactory nerve right here. Cranial nerve number 1, olfactory nerve. Now this brain's upside down. You're looking at the bottom side of it. So if I went like this and put that skull on there, what you can realize is that olfactory nerve sits right on both sides of the crista galli, because all your little nerves in your nose go up and hit the olfactory bulbs of the olfactory nerve, and they run to your brain and help you smell, allow you to smell. So this cribriform plate of your ethmoid bone has a whole bunch of little holes because it contains the nerves from your nose that go up to the olfactory nerve. So ethmoid bone, crista galli. Now you can see part of the ethmoid bone right up here in the nasal cavity. The very top of my nasal cavity is the ethmoid bone. That's the ethmoid bone. But that's about it for now. I will, when I get the lights on, show you that exploded skull up on the shelf, and you can see the ethmoid bone really well. Cribriform plate. Okay, this perpendicular plate that starts to separate the nasal cavity into two, the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone grows downward. This vomer bone grows upward, and they fuse together. So the perpendicular plate, the top one, and the vomer bone, the bottom one, fuse together to separate your nasal cavity into two. So that's the perpendicular plate right here. Going back to your list in order, here's the crista galli. The dura mater, by the way, of your brain hooks right to that crista galli. It goes right between your brain hemispheres and hooks right there. So the dura mater hooks there. The nasal concha. The superior and middle nasal concha, you can see right in here inside the nasal cavity. Here's the superior concha. Here's the middle concha. Here's the superior concha. Here's the middle concha. Some people pronounce it conchi, and that's fine. Probably with correct Latin, that's how you should pronounce it. A-E is the E sound, conchi. I say concha. So superior and middle nasal concha. All right. And the nasal septum is the fusion of this perpendicular plate and that vomer bone that creates this nasal septum that separates my nasal cavity into two. So the nasal septum is actually the fusion of two bones, the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone and the vomer bone, which we haven't named yet. All right, next is the mandible. Of course, the lower jaw bone versus the maxilla, which is your upper jaw. So the mandible, I'll put it on its side like this. The first thing on the mandible is the condyle. This is the condyle. I just took it out of the temporal mandibular joint. If your jaw clicks, when you move your jaw, if it clicks, you have some form of TMJ. Something wrong with your temporal mandibular joint. If you open your mouth wide and it locks and you have to move it to get it to unlock, to close your mouth, you have a TMJ problem, a temporal mandibular joint problem. This is the condyle of the mandible that makes this TMJ, this temporal mandibular joint. Because this is the temporal bone, that's the mandible. This joint is the temporal mandibular joint. It's one of the weirdest joints in the body. It actually has two synovial cavities. Some people call it a condylar joint. It's really technically a bicondylar joint. And we'll talk more about it when we do joints. It's the weirdest joint in our body. So that's the condyle. This is the mandibular notch right here. Right there's the mandibular notch. Now this is the coronoid process, where that number 52 is, right here. Here's how I remember it. Remember on your scapula you have the coracoid process? And remember down on your ulna you have the coronoid process? Well, you start up in your jaw and you have a coronoid process. Coronoid with an N. You go down to your scapula and you have a coracoid process. By the time you get down to your ulna, you're anoid. Coronoid. So coronoid, coracoid, coronoid. I know. Frustrating. But I always think of it that way, that you start out coronoid, coracoid, and I'm really annoyed by the time I get down here. Starting from top to bottom. This is the mandibular angle right here. That's the angle. Ramus means arm or branch. This is the mandibular ramus right here. So notch, coronoid process, ramus, angle. This is the body of my mandible, all across here. That's my body. And my body has two holes in it. This is the mental region of my body regions. It's the mental region. So these two foramen are called mental foramen. Mental foramen. Ramus body, mental foramen. Okay, the alveolar process. The alveolar process is nothing more than the bumps where my teeth enter my mandible. That's what the alveolar processes are. So if I have 32 teeth and 16 of them are on the bottom, then I have 16 alveolar processes in my mandible. Even if you have a tooth pulled, you still have an alveolar process, but you don't have a tooth there anymore. So these processes where the teeth enter my mandible are called alveolar processes. And lastly, I have a mandibular foramen. Yep, it's there. Now these are called mental foramen. So where's my mandibular foramen? Right here. On the inside. Right there and right there. Don't confuse these mandibular foramen on the inside with my mental foramen out here. Here and here. Any questions about the mandible? All right. Maxilla. The maxilla is where you grow your mustache. Here's the maxilla. This is the maxillary bone, all of this right here. The maxillary bone has these two foramen below the eye sockets that we already named, called the infraorbital foramen. So that's an infraorbital foramen of the maxilla. That's the infraorbital foramen of the maxilla. Remember, I had these supraorbital foramen of my frontal bone above the eye socket. So what else on the maxilla do you have to know? There is a maxillary sinus. Allow me to come back to that when I have the lights on. I got to find the model that has it. It's not on this model right here. There is a maxillary sinus. I'll show you. Oh, the palatine process. Now this is a little hard. Yeah, it's not hard, but it's you got to be a little careful. So I'm looking from the bottom. So this is my maxilla. This is the palatine process of my maxilla. And it grows backwards and meets the palatine bone. And they fuse right where those orange lines are. As a matter of fact, you can see that the palatine process of my maxilla fuses together. There's a process on each side, and they have to fuse together in the center. This whole thing, when it's all fused, make what we call the hard palate. And then right in here in space, there's soft tissue that make up what we call our soft palate. So the top of your mouth, when you're pushing your finger up in the top of your mouth, you're touching your hard palate until you get back to the soft tissue where your gag reflex is, and then you're touching your soft palate. So the palatine process of my maxilla and my palatine bone all make my hard palate. The alveolar processes of my maxilla are simply where the teeth go in my maxilla. That's all they are, just like the alveolar processes of my mandible. And there's an infraorbital foramen, which I already named for you right there. Any questions about the maxilla? Okay, what's a cleft palate? The failure of the palatine process of my maxilla to fuse. A cleft palate is the failure of the fusion of these palatine processes of my maxilla. That's a cleft palate. All right. Inferior nasal concha. I'll come back to that when the lights are on. I'll show you the exploded skull so you can see all three of them. I'll show you a model where you can see all three of them. The vomer I can see right here. The vomer bone is this bone right here, rising off the maxilla. It's growing upward to meet the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone, and they fuse to make the nasal septum. So that's the vomer right there. The zygomatic bone. We already did it, but we'll do it again. Here's the zygomatic bone. And this is the temporal process of the zygomatic bone. Remember, this is the temporal bone, and this is the zygomatic process of the temporal bone. Recall that the temporal process of the zygomatic bone and the zygomatic process of the temporal bone fuse in the center to make the zygomatic arch. Okay. The lacrimal bone. You look right down here. There's a little indentation right here where my lacrimal duct is. That's the lacrimal bone. That's where my tear duct or my lacrimal duct runs into my nasal cavity. If you wonder why your nose runs when you cry, it's because your tears are running down into your nose through this lacrimal duct. So you got that lacrimal bone right there. Lacrimal bone right here. Right there. Okay. The nasal bone. This is simply the nasal bone right here. The rest of your nose is cartilage. That's your nasal bone. And the palatine bone, I already pointed out to you, but I'll do it again. Here's the palatine bone right there. All right. Any questions about that? Because I owe you two things. I owe you the three concha, and I owe you middle and inferior nasal concha. Now, some people call these the turbinates. They're called turbinates when they're covered with tissue. They're called conchae when they're just bone. And that's kind of splitting a hair anyway. So if you hear these called turbinate bones, it's the same thing. Turbinates and conchae are the same thing. These canals between them are called a meatus. They're not the same thing. So superior, middle, and inferior nasal conchae. On my exploded skull, this is the exploded skull. I'll get it down and leave it down. It's really cool. Let me see if I can see all three conchae. Oh yeah, with a little bit of imagination. They're not great. The conchae are not great on this. You can see the maxillary sinus. You can see these cavities right here in the maxilla. That's your maxillary sinus. But I think I have a better maxillary sinus. Let me see where I have a better maxillary sinus. No, this is the frontal sinus. This is the sphenoid sinus. I don't have a better maxillary sinus on this model. I'm looking for it still. That's all I owe you, right? Maxillary sinus? Yes? No? You guys aren't talking to me? These are ethmoid sinuses right here. These are frontal sinus, ethmoid sinus. If I take this, all right, so it's ethmoid sinuses, frontal sinus. And I already showed you the sphenoid sinus before. All right, so that's that.